Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third Community Week session of today, our sixth session so far this week. This session is called A Window into Your Needs, Analyzing and Moving Through HathiTrust Digital Collection Survey Results, presented by members of our Digital Collection Strategy Working Group. I am Melissa Stewart, Assistant to the Executive Director of HathiTrust. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to our panelists and get started. So first of all, keep in mind that even though this is a virtual event, we expect everyone to comply with our code of conduct. Our code is posted here on this slide. It is available on our website, and it will be appearing in the chat if it has not already. And don't be afraid to email any reports if you feel anyone on this meeting is violating that code of conduct. Just a quick technology overview. All of you are familiar with Zoom. We are recording this session. Please make sure that if you are not one of the presenters, that you keep your camera and your microphones off to limit distractions. Please enter questions in the chat anytime. My colleague Jessica Rohr is going to be gathering those, and we will ask them at the appropriate time during the presentation. And also, if you need any technical support, also you can feel free to message Jessica, and transcriptions have been turned on if you need those. All right, make sure if you want to tweet us, use the hashtag HTCW22 and at us at HathiTrust. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to the Digital Collection Strategy Working Group.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Wade Wyckoff, and I am the chair of the Digital Collection Strategy Working Group. And I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon with three of my working group colleagues, Miranda Bennett, Fred Rasco, and Rice Majors. We'll start off our session this afternoon with a quick introduction to the working group and our members. We'll discuss some of the working group's activities over the past couple of years. And then we'll get into the topic that you've really come to hear about, the results of the survey that the working group recently conducted. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about some draft proposals that the working group has crafted, in part drawing on these results, and have some time for Q&A at the end. Next, please. So what we're hoping you'll come away from today's session with is some additional background on the Digital Collection Strategy Working Group, who we are, what we've been up to over the past couple of years. We're looking forward to sharing the highlights from our survey, and we'll hope that you'll gain some new information about the collection and Hathi members, but also see possibilities or find questions that you might want to explore at your own institution and in your institution's connections with HathiTrust. The survey results, together with our other activities, as I mentioned, led us to draft some proposals and that we felt would help support development of the digital library. These are really just at the very beginnings of a conversation with the HathiTrust staff and our governance groups. And at this stage, we're hoping you'll take a little time just to reflect on them and share your thoughts with us as part of the discussion in the Q&A at the end of the session. Next, please. So this is the current membership of the Digital Collection Strategy Working Group. We have 12 members, 11 of whom are drawn from the Hathi member libraries, and really represent the scope of the Hathi membership well, from large research-oriented universities and statewide systems to smaller institutions. We come from a mix of public and private institutions, and we're geographically distributed across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Rounding out our group is Heather Christensen and her knowledge of Hathi's own work and the planning that's happening in HathiTrust has really been invaluable to the group through our discussions over the past couple of years. And next slide, please. So we're a newish group. We started in 2020, and you can imagine that was an interesting year to try to get a new group started and working together. But we did well, I think, in that first year. It took us a little bit to get going, but that was mostly down to me. The working group is charged by the program steering committee, and we report up to that group as part of the Hathi governance structure. Those of you who've been engaged with Hathi for a while may remember that there was a collections committee that PSC members of that committee, including myself, were part of the founding membership of the current working group. Our charge from PSC currently calls on us to think a little holistically about the digital library and the collection. Much of the digital library as it exists now is an outcome of the need for preservation of Google Books content, so mass digitized content. And that's still a really important role for Hathi and for the digital library. The working group is asked to think about how we might build on that and further develop the Hathi digital collection. Digging a little bit deeper into that, we've been asked to consider opportunities to bring more intentional and more directed collection development to the digital library that would sit alongside the mass digitization work that's been the mainstay of Hathi collection building for many years, as well as opportunities to strengthen diversity in the collection, sort of broadly considered language or region or underrepresented groups, or even resources that maybe don't fit into that mass digitization model, and to bring those into the digital library collection. Building on those aspects, we're tasked to develop proposals for activities or services or projects that we think would help us to approach this type of collection building, and to bring those for discussion with the program steering committee, with HathiTrust staff, and with the Board of Governors as needed. And finally, we're asked to consider ways to help Hathi members better understand and take full advantage of the potential of the digital library. So this piece of our charge is aimed a little bit more at communicating outward to the members and engagement with the members about the existing HathiTrust collection rather than building it up. So at this point, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Miranda, who's going to talk a little bit about what we've been working on.
All right, thank you so much, Wade, and thank you all for joining us today. Like Wade, I've been part of this group from the beginning, and I'm really pleased to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing. So as throughout our meetings, we've had a number of really interesting discussions, and some important and interesting themes have come out. One is, I think we've all really gained greater appreciation for the value of the HathiTrust Digital Library to member libraries, and that's been very exciting to see. We've talked about that from our own perspective within our own libraries, but also what we've learned from interactions with many of you, with the HathiTrust staff, and with through some of the tools that we've, or some of the approaches that we've taken that I'll talk more about in a minute. We've talked a lot about what diversity means within the context of the HathiTrust Digital Library. This is really central to the charge of our committee. It's really important, a really important part of the digital collection principles. That is something that we've worked on. So diversity, there's sort of diversity within diversity. We've talked about diversity along a number of different dimensions, from racial and ethnic diversity to diversity in genre, diversity in the type of library that's contributing, and so on. We've talked a lot about what it is that might be preventing member libraries from contributing to the digital library. Not all member libraries do contribute. I was actually asking Natalie Fulkerson earlier today about the current statistics, and she said about 30% of member libraries do contribute content. And so we've talked a lot about what is it that's keeping that other 70% from participating in this part of HathiTrust membership. And we really look forward to working both with member volunteers and with HathiTrust a bit to make that part of membership more accessible, which will lead to diversifying the collection further. And then, as Wade was talking about, a big part of our work has been thinking about so much of HathiTrust Digital Library has been built through processes of mass digitization, primarily Google Books, also Internet Archive, and a relatively small percentage has come from locally digitized material from member libraries. But that type of digitization, that approach to digitization projects really offers great opportunities for diversifying the collections. And you probably heard about some of that if you've been to other sessions during Community Week. So at the inaugural Community Week in 2020, this group hosted a couple of discussion sessions. There were sort of like focus groups for us where we were able to gather information from representatives from people in member libraries. Some of you may have participated in one of those sessions. And that really addressed some of the same themes that I've already talked about in terms of diversity, barriers to digitization, what can member libraries do to help, how could they get more involved. The HathiTrust Digital Collection Principles, this is a really great achievement. This was the result of a lot of work on the part of Heather Christensen on the HathiTrust staff. And our group was really very fortunate to get to be part of the development of that document. It is now live on the website. I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. I think it's a very important document. And it'll really lay out, I think, some of it will really guide the work of developing the HathiTrust Digital Library for the next several years. Wade also noted that part of our charge has to do with communication and outreach. So we've had Jessica Rohr as a guest at a number of our meetings. She's been tremendously helpful as well. So we are really interested both in helping people affiliated with member libraries learn more about HathiTrust generally, and also starting to build up more of a community, particularly within the collections folks in HathiTrust libraries. So I think there are some really wonderful opportunities there. And then our most recent project has been a member survey. So some of you here may have participated in that. And now we're going to tell you a little bit about the structure of that survey and some of what we learned. So I will turn the mic over to Fred, who's going to walk you through that part of our.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. So yeah, as Miranda said, we decided, well, as the graphic says on the screen, we asked ourselves, shall we make a survey? And we responded, yes, we shall. So we put together about 10 questions, and I'm putting a link in the chat if you want to see a PDF version of the survey that we sent online. And I'll talk about the questions in just a minute, but first I wanted to give a brief overview, high-level overview of who responded to this survey. So we got 92 total responses to this survey, and those were representative of 68 institutions, which I'm told, I did not do the math, but it's 32% of HathiTrust member institutions. And most of the responses that we got came from Tier 2 and Tier 3 members, which sort of reflect levels of resources available to the library broadly, I suppose. And the responses came from a variety of job titles. We sent it to folks that were in charge of collections at libraries. So we got back responses from library deans and directors, associate deans, assistant deans, titles like collections manager or director, other kinds of department heads. So that's who we heard from. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. This is, without going into every question on the survey, this is what we wanted to know from those questions. We wanted to get an idea of the local landscape of collection development and digitization from folks who would respond. And the local landscape involve things like, are you a Google Books partner? Are you currently contributing to HathiTrust? Are you contributing to another digital library? Is your library strategically committed to adding items collection? We also wanted to know about barriers to contributing. We wanted to know from respondents what would help facilitate contributing to HathiTrust, And would collection managers, deans, et cetera, consider HathiTrust policies, or do they consider HathiTrust policies when developing their own collection policies? We also wanted to know what HathiTrust members needed to know. We want to know do members want to know what HathiTrust wants? Do members want to know if HathiTrust is looking for a particular category of contribution? Do they want to know more about what HathiTrust is doing within copyright work? It's the kind of information that we wanted to elucidate from our members so that we could get a better picture of what members needed to know. We also wanted to hear directly from members what they thought would improve diversity in the HathiTrust collection. So that's kind of what we were aiming to learn with the 10 questions and the options that we had in this questionnaire that we sent out. And I believe next we have Rice, who is going to talk about some of the responses that we got.
Yeah, and next slide, please. Great. So we're really encouraged by the percentage of respondents who indicated that representation and inclusion are highly salient to their library and their institution. So we're coming in at 78% there, which I think is a fantastic number for us to start planning with. On the barriers side, we saw respondents pointing to a number of barriers that they face to contributing material. So HathiTrust technical requirements were cited. Your own capacity to digitize materials was another significant one. And then HathiTrust's focus on digitized print and or on the Google content format, exclusion of other formats, all were significant barriers to participation or to fuller participation than you might be doing right now. Next slide. I'm not seeing the next slide. Maybe I don't.
What's the slide?
It's listening. So thank you. One other interesting result was the response to several.
I lost my connection. I'll be right back to sharing my screen once here you go.
No worries. So this was a question to ask you to rank several possible bits of information that might help guide your actions, with an option to do a write-in as well if you had a situation that was not covered by the scripted answers. And respondents were interested in all of the listed options. Librarians typically want more information to help them, but particularly called out were first, wanting to have a list of items your institution holds that are not in the HathiTrust Digital Library, and two, wanting to know HathiTrust plans for future access services for rights protected materials, and those were both prefabricated options for people to pick from. So with that, I'll turn it over to Miranda to cover our takeaways.
Thank you, Rice. Yeah, so for takeaways, I'm going to just give you a brief reflection, a little more conceptual, and then Wade will talk about some of the practical ideas that our working group is focused on next. So with this, I was trying to take some of the results from the survey and put them in a little bit of maybe a virtuous circle of survey results. It's very clear that diversifying collections is a strategic priority for many HathiTrust member libraries, 70. They're also, you are all interested in contributing to the common good. This is a value that's held by many HathiTrust member libraries, and it's pretty central to what HathiTrust is doing. So if you think about content contributing libraries, and again, that's right now a bit under a third of member libraries, but it could be more, that are adding diverse materials. This is helping to increase the diversity of the HathiTrust Digital Library. And that actually helps to advance the goal of collection diversity for all of us. So a more diverse collection becomes more valuable to all the members. It's something that we can all point to with a lot of pride, and as something that aligns with and advances a really important strategic priority for our library collections. And so in order to make this happen, what do we need? What do we collectively need? What can we collectively work on? Selection guidance. So working with HathiTrust staff and working with groups like ours to help provide some guidelines, whether it's specific title lists or more general priority areas. And then additional support for that digitization and ingest process. And again, that is not at all something that any of us thinks, HathiTrust staff need to be taking on. We have I think, some really interesting ideas about how members can support each other in that process. So I think it's really exciting to see the work of this working group come together, and I'll turn it over to Wade to talk about some of the specifics for next steps.
Great, thanks, Miranda. So before we get to the proposals themselves, I just want to provide a little bit of context about where we are in this process. So I mentioned earlier that we're just starting the conversation around these proposals. We met with PSC about 2 weeks ago at this point for some initial impressions and some initial thoughts from them, from that group. But that's really the very beginning of this discussion, and there's still quite a bit of work to do at this point. We are including a proposal here isn't necessarily a commitment that it's going to be implemented or that it would be implemented in a specific way. Those decisions would grow out of that larger conversation with PSC, with the HathiTrust staff, and potentially with the Board of Governors, depending on the level of resourcing that will be involved and the strategic changes that might be involved in implementing some of these. So I want to is proposing for conversation, but changes and prioritizing of this work is likely as that conversation progresses. Next, please. So the actual proposals, these are numbered for ease of reference. They're not in any particular order. But just starting at the top, a common theme, as we talked about from Community Week event in 2020, from the survey results, and from the working group's own conversations, is that the technical requirements and the metadata requirements for contributing can be a challenge for the member libraries. And so we felt that forming a group that's drawn from the member libraries and coordinated by a HathiTrust staff member, this is something we do really well. There are lots of these groups that are active in different ways. Forming a group that was focused specifically on helping members and guiding them through this deposit process might be something that would be beneficial to the membership and to bringing more libraries into the contributor stream. The larger goal of a group like this would be to provide that level of assistance that members, to help members with questions and problems and challenges that come up in meeting those technical requirements and navigating that process, and to bring more contributions from more libraries into the digital library. Our second proposal was to form a task force or possibly revise the charge of the collection strategy working group to develop criteria or guidelines or models that would assist members in selecting and prioritizing materials from their collections for digitization. So as Rice mentioned earlier, and Miranda talked about as well, and one of the interesting in their own decision would be valuable for addition to the digital library. Part of this might also take the form of information for members who participate in mass digitization programs like Google Books or who work with the Internet Archive on how they could maximize the value of those programs to add some local materials or some materials that wouldn't normally be part of those digitization streams to the digital library. We also heard clearly, and many of us also know from our own experiences in our own institutions, that resources for digitization are limited. So the goal of a group like this or a project like this would be to provide member libraries with the tools to help them more readily identify those items or categories of materials in their collections that, if digitized, would have the greatest strategic benefit to the digital library, would do the most to expand it and deepen the collection. Number 3, expanding the permitted formats in the digital library. We know this is something that's been on the radar at HathiTrust for a while. It comes up in other venues, so I don't think this is a surprising one that it might have ended up on our list. That said, it's important to recognize that this would be a very large undertaking. Expanding the format of the files and materials that are supported for deposit in the digital library would have implications across Hathi's program activities and the infrastructure. And it's not something that we could really undertake without really careful consideration about those impacts and the ability and willingness of the collective membership to support the resourcing of that work. But the goal of something like this would be to bring additional types of content into the digital library, such as born digital publications, audiovisual materials like oral histories or local recordings that might bring content to the digital library that doesn't exist in a more traditional published book-like form. Additional government documents, perhaps, that have never existed in a printed form either, as governments have gone digital in their publishing. Or even digitization done by member libraries that may be more oriented to access than to preservation. So maybe we have collections in our repositories, in our local repositories of PDFs, but not the TIFF files that would go with them that would be more preservation oriented. So thinking about the possibilities there is something that we've also brought forward for some further discussion. And number 4, drawing from the HathiTrust Research Center and the accessible text request service to consider gaps in materials that are identified through those programs or areas of the collection that are well used and could be deepened to better support the members. And because those types of requests, particularly HTRS, may also be time sensitive, thinking about forming a pilot group of libraries who would be prepared to digitize and deposit on fairly short timeframes for materials that are held in their collections. So HTRC and HTRS both support users who have different needs or different access requirements than users who may be doing more traditional reading of the book online, as many of us have done. So the larger goal for this activity would be to a more traditional preservation-oriented digitization efforts or the mass digitization approaches. So thinking about things like course materials, for example, that might be benefiting HathiTrust users, members users through HTRS, and also thinking about how we could deepen the corpus of materials that are available for non-consumptive research processes through the HTRC. So those are our 4 proposals. If you can go ahead, Melissa, this is where we're going to turn the floor over to you. So if you have questions or comments for the working group, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and Melissa and Jessica will help us monitor the chat and manage the conversation. And I will, throw it open to my working group colleagues on the call also to chime in on any questions that come in.
Thanks a lot. This was a really great presentation. It was really interesting for me to hear all of that you learned. And yeah, please put questions in the chat if you have any. Um, I have one that's a comment in support of suggestion number 4. Great to use those other programs to see where some of the gaps might be. And do any of you, are you ready to talk about at all yet about next steps? Or
Yeah, a little bit. I think, I think our next step, I have a meeting with Denise Pan, who's the incoming chair of PSC, just to talk about where we're going to go with this next. So there will be some further discussions with PSC. And I think out of that conversation, we'll start to focus in a little bit more on exactly how we want to move this conversation forward, and which of these recommendations or proposals we might want to focus on first. Some of them are more resource intensive than others. Some of them could be implemented more easily than others. So I think that will all be part of that conversation. And that's really, I think the next step is just to continue that conversation with the program steering committee and hone in on exactly what the next piece of work is around these proposals. For the working group, we'll also be coming back to the communications plan that Miranda mentioned earlier. That's something we'd started working on with Jessica a while back. And we started working on the survey, and that one got put on hold a little bit. So I want us to come back to that and start thinking about how we can do some communication outward to the members and engage with the members around the existing collection.
Can you talk at all about how librarians holding submissions would require some expansion of requested fields that might be used to identify areas of underrepresentation in the corpus in relation to local holdings? I don't know if I articulated that.
Yeah, I think I know where Jeff is going with that. The holdings reports, the holdings information we submit right now is pretty basic. It's OCLC numbers and a little bit of other information. From what I recall, it's been a little bit since I've been engaged in doing that, but you don't get things like subject headings and classification information and those types of things. We have talked about that inside the working group as something that might be necessary to facilitate some of this, or opportunities or ways that HathiTrust might work with OCLC or with the larger metadata records to do some work on that. Again, those are much bigger conversations, but analysis is something that's already on the HathiTrust agenda, and exploring that more broadly, I think, is probably something that's already being contemplated. But I would defer to the HathiTrust staff on specifics of some of that work. But yeah, for sure, it did come up that we might need more detailed information in order to do some of this work effectively.
Do you have any more details on what the survey said about barriers to contribution?
I think that the ones that stick in my mind are the ones that we talked about in terms of the technical requirements for deposit, the resources available for digitization, were kind of the key things that we heard. But I would invite others to jump in and add to that.
Yeah, that's without having the actual quotes. So that's my memory as well. There are a lot of technical obstacles, resource obstacles. I believe there's some comments about how it's steps. I think was the gist of comments, like the convoluted process of submission.
Do you have a request to go over the survey results slide one more time? Let me go back. Here we go. Interested in understanding how responses to plans for future access services for rights protected materials manifest in the results. I think that's the yellow in the graph here, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is sorry, Wade, I jumped in there.
Go ahead, Rice.
Yeah. So I think this is a lot of member libraries just very organically have questions about what does the future look like post ETOS. So ETOS gave some of our own users, like faculty on my campus, got used to having that access, and they're now asking some questions about that. And I think a lot of us have been asking questions about what might be possible in the future. So I'm trying to speak on behalf of users rather than speak on behalf of HathiTrust what that future might look like. But so users are wanting to know, is there any kind of direction that things might be going in that we should plan around? And I mean, I can see how that would inform, like, do I digitize public domain material first, or do I digitize stuff that might be available for other kind of lawful uses? And so I don't know if that answered, go back to Claire's question.
Yeah. Okay. So interest is high. Did the group have recommendations around that? Just to follow up.
We didn't frame any recommendations specifically around that at this point. You know, access to materials during some future emergency that closes our libraries, or controlled digital lending type model is something that I think is also on the radar again at HathiTrust, and there are conversations that are happening there. But we recognize definitely that it's something where there is significant interest from the membership.
And maybe the one caveat there is that I'm forgetting the acronym now, but for folks who have a print reading disability, so those materials, they can have that kind of access to materials held in copyright. And if that service got some, if we looked at how that's played out and whether there's an appetite to digitize on demand to support that, I would think that would be one thing, but it's not really quite the heart of what you're asking, Claire.
Have you asked specifically about where technical shortfalls lie for members interested in local digitization? Is it the file formats or just no availability for scanning at all?
We didn't drill into that in detail in the survey. You know, from the results, and others, please jump in on this as well. My sense is that it was a combination of both of them. Some institutions just don't have the capacity to do local digitization, and that is part of the reason they don't contribute, is that they're not digitizing locally at this point on any kind of scale. In some instances, it is getting things into the right file format to deposit, getting the metadata into the right format to deposit that has been the challenge. So that's an area that could be further explored, perhaps, to identify supports that would be most useful to the members.
I should also say, if you've had more than 3 questions, you're now on our committee.
That's right. Watch for the call from members coming out later.
Right. Any more questions for this group? Now they're going to be afraid to ask. Put on the list.
Hi, everyone. This is Heather Christensen. I just wanted to chime in on the question about more specifics on barriers. There were some things that the survey highlighted that were barriers, just that the technical requirements were kind of, we're challenging, probably need some interpretation for people, and maybe, input and adjustment. The documentation could be more clear, or kind of brought to a level of someone kind of entering it at a beginner level. And then just kind of resources, right? As we know with digitization, that's kind of always the ultimate issue to solve.
Any more questions for this great group? This is just more of a comment. Access a la ETAS is just one part of the picture for rights protected content. I think there's potential for a working group to grapple with things like that and why it's in members' interest to digitize protected content, how that content may be used short of ETAS level access, intersections with shared print retention programs, etc. It's true. We recently were reminded that many major publishers have opted out of digitization by the Google Library project. This means that there will be significant gaps in the collection for the late 20th century and recent publications. Is this an issue the group has discussed? Local digitization will need somehow to fill these gaps.
Great, I'm happy to respond. I would say this has largely been a no so far in terms of whether we've discussed it. I think we'd want to see, well, I think the landscape for what you can do with stuff that's still held in copyright is like changing while we're having this conversation. So I think that will come to inform our conversations more going forward, but we're not quite there yet. But Renata is totally a thing that we'll have to grapple with eventually. Some of that content is also available as ebooks, like that you could buy as born ebooks, which may or may not be legally distinguished from kinds of materials that are not available for sale as an ebook. And I don't know that that'll end up being a differential, but it could be in terms of what the possible uses are. But at least for HTRC, kind of non-consumptive uses, eventually I think we'd want to get this content available.
And I just bumped my mouse and advanced the slide by accident. We're still welcome to take more questions.
I just want to thank Heather for that comment she made just a minute ago, and also add that although technical barriers and things like that were prominent, there are also other barriers mentioned, like wanting to know from HathiTrust the value of POM. So it wasn't all technical barriers.
Any other questions? Jeff's got some comments in answer to Rice's question in the chat about priorities for organizational contributions.
Those are some really interesting comments from Jeff. And you can certainly do some of this analysis yourself with the holdings reports that come back from HathiTrust. It's a little bit cumbersome sometimes to work with the size of those files. I've tried inside my iOS to import those files and run reports of things that are in my collection but not in HathiTrust, or to do that with subsets of things. But certainly is doable to think about ways that you can draw out specific pieces of your collection, either based on those reports or just your own knowledge of the collection and what is likely to be or not to be in the HathiTrust collection.
Yeah, and I can just make a little plug for a presentation that Renata will be hosting on Thursday at the Birds of a Feather session. And I will be talking a little bit about exactly that process that Wade was just alluding to. I was working on a slide earlier today that is titled, "What can you do with 428,417 OCLC numbers?" So yes, there are challenges involved, but there are ways that you may be able to start at least investigating what might be some potential categories of material that it would be great for your library to contribute to HathiTrust.
Another minute or so to see if we've got any more questions. I would remind you all that I will be sending the recording out once it's done processing and posted. It'll probably be tomorrow or the next day. And then I'll send the slides along with that, as well as we do have a survey that we can link in the chat. Please provide feedback to help us shape more sessions in the future. We really would appreciate you completing that and giving us your thoughts. I am going to stop sharing my screen, but we can certainly stay on if you have any more questions. Other than that, I guess I am going to stop the recording.